The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is calling on the federal government to get serious about Canada's place in the world. In a letter addressed to the Prime Minister, the president of the group writes that partners in the Indo-Pacific region increasingly view Canada as a, quote, well-meaning but unserious player on the international stage. Perrin Beatty says Canada can, quote, no longer take for granted these stable and peaceful international conditions. Instead, he is calling for a, quote, sober assessment of our international priorities and a recalibration of how we engage with other nations. Perrin Beatty joins me now. Hello, sir, and welcome to Power and Politics.
Hi, Brett. Glad to be with you.
So you write that officials and businesses in the Indo-Pacific consider Canada an unserious player on the world stage. Why do you think they're saying that?
It actually goes well beyond there. It goes to our allies in Europe as well, our colleagues in NATO and elsewhere. There's a feeling that too often we're reactive in international relations as opposed to having a strategic policy, and that too often we're more focused on good feelings than on good outcomes.
Well, how is this perception, at least in your opinion, impacting Canada's role in world affairs?
Well, I think the important thing is that our role in international relations is shrinking, and we are drifting toward irrelevance. This is happening at a time when Canada has what the world wants, and where this could be Canada's moment. If you take a look at some of the great issues that we're facing today as a result of geopolitics and how the situation has changed, food security, energy security are two of the key areas. And Canada has the resources that we need to make a real difference. The three F's of food, fuel, fertilizer. We have critical minerals in wide supply, which are critical for both security and for the e-vehicle industry. But our challenge is we don't have a strategy to supply the world, and we don't have the infrastructure in place to enable us to do it.
Well, Mr. Beatty, we have reached out to the government for a response to your concerns. We haven't got one just yet, but I would imagine the government would argue that they are taking things seriously. For example, you could point to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly alleging that the Indian government may have been involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, and that may speak to some of the struggles in the Indo-Pacific region. How would you respond to that?
Well, it'd be pretty hard not to have noticed the fact that a Canadian citizen was assassinated on Canadian soil. The question is, what is our strategy for the region? And when we look at the Indo-Pacific at the present time, it is an area in which the government is focused, and that's a good thing. But our relationship is very fraught with the two largest players, both China and India. And it's going to be important for us to look at how do we refocus in that region now. For example, on Japan and Korea, which are both industrialized democracies, in which both believe in the rule of law, and both of them have relationships that we could deepen significantly between our two countries.
And so what can the government do right now to start reversing the trend? Certainly the Trudeau government would not be the first in Canadian history to be accused of conducting foreign affairs for domestic purposes and partisan gain. But what can they do now?
Well, I think that's the first thing. Let's start by looking at where Canada's strategic interests lie. We should not be determining foreign policy based on what the political impacts are within Canada itself. We should be looking at where are Canada's strategic interests? Where do we have the opportunity to increase our trade, or to make a contribution to global security, or to make a contribution to food security, energy security, and so on. And we need as well, when we're looking at what we can do in terms of supplying the needs of the world, to look at the infrastructure that we have in Canada, because we lack the infrastructure to be able to move our goods to market in the way in which we should. If we are truly serious, what we need to do is to recognize that the present global situation represents both an incredible threat, but also an opportunity and an obligation for Canada to try to make a difference, to promote stability, promote democracy, to encourage a healthier economy as well for Canadians. And we can do that. This could be Canada's moment if we're prepared to seize it.
In your letter, you also call on the federal government to prioritize hitting NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending commitment. There's no indication that will happen anytime soon. And Canada's fiscal room to massively increase spending simply isn't there. I think the parliamentary budget officer estimated it would be upwards of $18 billion. So why is now the time to hit that target?
Nobody expects that the government can reverse this overnight. The question is the trajectory that we're on and whether or not we're determined to meet our commitment. We're in the bottom quartile of countries within NATO in terms of percentage of GDP that we contribute to defense. And when you look at our inability to defend ourselves adequately in our own northern region, or to contribute to collective security along with our NATO allies, this is a major concern. It's interesting that at the same time as I wrote my letter, Rear Admiral Ochterlony was giving an interview in the news media where he was talking about the fact that our allies are seeing us as increasingly unserious, that they question whether or not we are a reliable partner. What this means is that when the Australians and the British and the Americans come together for the Australia, UK, US agreement, Canada was simply left out. We learned about this at the same time as the rest of the world did. There was a time when the first instinct of our colleagues was, how do we get the Canadians involved? Now it's become, should we inform the Canadians? We need to rebuild a strategic partnership with our allies around the world. And to do that, we have to be serious ourselves about making a commitment.
And Mr. Beatty, as if all this wasn't enough, you're also drawing attention to the upcoming U.S. presidential election this year. It's an election that could very well see Donald Trump re-elected as president. What's at stake for Canada this November?
It's massive. What's at stake? We do 2/3 of our business with one customer. If any business was doing that, they would focus very clearly on that bilateral relationship. And the challenge that we have is we may have a competition for the presidency of the United States between two people trying to outflank each other on protectionism. And in 2026, the three countries who are signatories to CUSMA, the trilateral free trade agreement that we have in North America, will have to signal whether or not they want to have the agreement continue. This means we can't afford to wait until 2025 to start to take our message out, particularly to the United States, to say to Americans in all parts of the US that it's in their interest that we maintain and that we deepen this relationship. Unfortunately, we have a relationship that was once strategic, which has become transactional. And when it's transactional, what happens is it gets lost to domestic political concerns in the United States.
All right, we are out of time for this segment. Mr. Beatty, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.